Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Matt Longstaff. I'm the finance director for CLASS, and I would like to begin the webinar by acknowledging the Indigenous people of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I will take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt, and hello, everyone. My name is Amadeus Ginolfi, and I am delighted to introduce today's guest, Dr. Gabriel Prieto. He obtained a PhD at Yale University. He taught at the Universidad Nacional de Trujillo, and now he is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Florida. And Dr. Prieto's primary research interest is the study of ancient maritime adaptations in the South Pacific coast, with a specific focus on the north coast of Peru, and especially on the domestic settlements and the mortuary practices of small fishing communities, and the impact of climatic events like El Niño on their settlements. And in 2016, Dr. Prieto started the ongoing Huanchaco Archaeological Program. At Huanchaco and Huanchaquito, his team has uncovered what is considered the largest ancient child and camelid sacrifice ever found in the world. And this event took place during the 15th century AD, when the Chimú Empire was controlling the Peruvian north coast. But however, today he will talk about the late early Horizon occupation of Huanchaco. So now I will let him begin his talk, and I will say thank you in advance to him.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to the Canadian Latin American Council, and especially to Amadeo Esginofoli. Sorry if I pronounce it wrong, Amadeo, because I happened to meet him in the past year, and we've been exchanging a lot of interesting ideas. So such a brilliant student, and doing great stuff in the north coast of Peru. So and being this said, I'm going to start my presentation. I'm so glad that I don't have to talk about human sacrifice today, and this is, you know, I'm not quejándome, right? But I think that the Huanchaco Archaeological Program has more to offer. And there are really very limited spaces where we can actually talk about our ongoing research, and especially with the different time periods. One of the major goals of the Huanchaco Archaeological Program is really to understand the social dynamics and the economic interactions of these maritime communities across time. And that means studying at least since the initial period around 1500 BC until present day. So little by little, we are trying to fulfill all our goals and all our expectations in terms of studying the collections that we have excavated in previous years. And little by little, we are learning a little more about the social dynamics of these people. So today I'm going to focus on the late early horizon, which basically is around 400 to 100 BC. And I'm just going to present the materials that and the context that were found in Huanchaco in relation with this time period. So let me start here. So the early horizon is a key period in Andean prehistory because it seems to have the secret ingredient for the emergence of social complexity in this part of the world. As complex and diverse as it could be, it is still poorly understood. And the first part of the early horizon, emphasizing the role played by Chavin in the configuration of what it was actually the first pan-Andean religious movement, is better understood. In contrast, the second part, I mean, the late part of the early horizon, known broadly as post-Chavin times, is still blurry and poorly known. The lack of monumental architecture is one of the many visible features during this time, along with the emergence of large human aggregations that are considered as proto-urban settlements. Examples of these urban settlements are in Huambacho, Cailán, and Samanco, in the Nepeña Valley, and Cerro Arena in the Moche Valley. Both share large rectangular architectural compounds where domestic, ceremonial, and productive activities were carried out. Exclusive areas with colonnades and quadrangular patios, some of them attached to low platforms with geometric decoration and portable plate cones with unique symbols, hosted large feasting events where marine and river valley products were consumed, and along with lacustrine resources available throughout the valley. At least in Samanco, Matt Helmer, and previously in Huambacho and Cailán, Dr. David Chiquan, large caravansaries were accommodated for camelid herds, suggesting that intra-valley and distant exchange the networks were in operation by the aid of llamas. Although some of the dates suggest that these sites were occupied as early as 800 BC, most of the available C14 results points to a 400 to 200 calibrated BC, coinciding with the collapse of the Chavin sphere of interaction. Slightly south of the Nepeña, in the Casma Valley, the sites of San Diego resembles those just mentioned here, while Chanquillo emerged as a unique fortified temple that hosts also a large solar calendar. Similar, but less spectacular, buildings have been documented for the same time period in the Santa Valley by Wilson. The exceptional discovery of model clay warriors holding darts, shields, and spears, like the ones you see here, suggests that at least in this region, warfare and the defense of sacred shrines and temples was an important part of the social agenda. For the Moche Valley, the only site of the late early horizon widely excavated was Cerro Arena by the Chanchan Moche Valley project directed by Dr. Michael Mosley and Carol Mackin. However, there are other sites of this period in the valley that unfortunately have been properly explored. Cerro Arena, excavated first by Elias Mujica and then by Curtis Brennan, was built on the slopes of the southern bank of the Moche River, 8 kilometers from the shoreline, but closer to the river and the arable land. It seems to control a major route along the southern bank of the river, as well as the traffic coming from the valley south of the Moche Valley. Brennan counted a minimum of 2,000 separated structures of varying size, covering approximately 1.2 square kilometers. There seems to be a great variability in the quality of construction and finish of walls among different structures and even among different rooms within the same structure. Brennan identified various classes of types of room and structures. I will highlight here that the most important of all of these is that there were domestic and non-domestic structures, being of different quality and some better finished than others. Some were organized around plazas, while others in two areas separated by corridors. The most diverse type of residences were those of the low to moderate social status, as Brennan called it, suggesting a great variety of the social component. This complicated system of categorization suggests, however, that they function primarily as residential quarters for families, either nuclear or extended, possessing unusually high status or wealth in this community. One remarkable aspect of Cerro Arena is that most of the domestic and non-domestic structures were located in direct association with the central and southern passes, as they were called, indicating that the primary focus of interest of the community life was the commercial traffic flow between the southern valleys like the Viru and the Moche. The emphasis on constructing on the upper parts of the hills suggests some strategic locations as well as defensive for elite residents and also administrative functions. Plazas organized in smaller rooms and directed routes to avoid or to reach specific areas makes of Cerro Arena a complex settlement in the valley. Although recent excavations by Jean-François Miller determined that Cerro Arena was occupied by a short period of time and that it represented a case of a halted city, it does not deny that it has existed and functioned for some time, as he actually agreed. Based on his detailed analysis of architectural patterns, Brennan suggests an emergent pattern of social differentiation, although he acknowledged that it is possible that social differentiation extended beyond ascribed social ranking to true economically based class stratification, and whether or not the first beginnings of a state-level institution had begun to appear. As I will show later, the data from Huanchaco may suggest that he was right in his thoughts. Cerro Arena was not an isolated site in the Moche Valley. And as it's seen in this map, the one on the left, other large settlements seems to have been preferentially concentrated on the southern side of the river, which includes a possible settlement in Salaberry area. The Huanchaco Bay seems to be the only located on the northern side of the valley, with a potential Salinar settlement in the vicinity of Chanchan, where Cristobal Campana in 2006 reported Salinar ceramic vessels on the west side of the Chimú city. Thanks to recent C14 dates, the Salinar occupation dates to around 400 to 200 calibrated BC in Huanchaco. Although it is not obvious as Chavin, I would like to suggest that the lack of monumental platforms, comparing with precedent late ceramic and initial period, white on red ceramic vessels, both domestic and fine ware, the unique presence of burnished patterns on ceramic processing, ceramic pan pipes, slate arrow points, and the increasing introduction of camelids for transportation and for food purposes during this short period of time qualified to keep considered it as part of the early horizon. This claim goes against the assumption that it should be placed as part of the early intermediate period. And of course, we can play with names and numbers, but I think that the nature of Salinar is more towards the early horizon rather than getting closer to the later development of typical early intermediate period groups. The 9 dates available for the Salinar occupation in Huanchaco were taken from secure context and such as hearts and burials in direct association with architecture and floored occupations. As it can be seen, the dates are consistent in showing an occupation between 400 and 200 calibrated BC in Huanchaco. As I will show later, these occupational contexts are sealed by Viru and Moche occupations. There seems to be a transitional period between the end of Salinar and the beginning of Viru presence, which blurs a little this moment, occurring around 200, 150, 100 calibrated BC. Some Viru dates actually overlap with this range, being the earliest Viru dates around 150, 100 calibrated BC. In any case, it shows a consistent occupation for roughly 200 years, where the people in Huanchaco used large jars and pots decorated with white paint on red, something that won't be seen in the subsequent periods. However, the cultural features observed goes beyond ceramics, and in this presentation, I will characterize this late early horizon occupation that the tradition forced me to call Salinar, basically from two sites, Pampa La Cruz and Iglesia Colonial de Huanchaco. So this is an aerial photo of the 1940s of Huanchaco, and so Pampa La Cruz and Iglesia Colonial de Huanchaco are two very complex sites. In terms of size, Pampa La Cruz used to have 11 hectares on its upper sector and almost 3 hectares on its lower sector. So more than 3 hectares here and 11 hectares in all this area. With deep deposits reaching from 2.5 to 5 meters in depth in some areas and only a few centimeters deep from the surface in other sectors. The main features of the site were a dense occupation on its southwest sector, right here, including an artificial platform that was built during the Viru occupation and then reoccupied and modified during the Moche and Chimú occupations. The northeast side has 2 platforms and an extensive system of irrigation canals and pre-Hispanic fields built during the Chimú times, including a sort of very unusual administrative center. And you can see here Mount 2 and Mount 3, and this is the administrative center here, that probably was managed by the Chimus to direct their cultivations and all their business over there. Unfortunately, today, most of this evidence is gone, and a modern town lays on top of the former archaeological site. My excavations are located on the southwest side of the southwest sector of the site, right here, where an area of approximately 6,000 square meters has survived. The excavations carried out between 2016 and 2019 have yielded an early Salinar occupation. One limitation, though, is that due to deep deposits, it was impossible to fully excavate a complete residence or architectural compound of this period. This situation is preventing us from exploring properly the domestic and ceremonial activity of the Salinar occupation. I can affirm that at Pampa La Cruz, the Salinar occupation is residential, but despite a few burials, there was not found a large cemetery in this site. What it is undoubtful is that Salinar is the earliest occupation in this site, laying directly above the sterile soil. Extensive excavations directed by my colleague and friend, Victor Campaña, has not found a single Cupisnique or other earlier occupation evidence in this site. So it supports our ideas. La Iglesia Colonial de Huanchaco was at some point the largest site in the Huanchaco area after Chanchan. This was also a multi-component site with pre-ceramic agricultural fields and canals, roads, cemeteries, possibly domestic areas, and a large ceremonial and ritual sector occupied during the Salinar period. And of course, as you see in this picture, this is almost all gone. On top of this, the site has the colonial occupation, where the building of the church is basically the pearl of the crown, as well as the colonial and Republican cemetery next to it. Actually, the Huanchaco Cemetery is the oldest Republican cemetery in the city of Trujillo. So it's another interesting place to look in the future. Like Pampa La Cruz, the Salinar occupation is deeply buried by Republican, colonial, Chimu Inca, Chimu, Moche, and Viru occupations, making again very difficult for excavations. Nevertheless, it is remarkable that in terms of occupational volume, the Salinar occupation is the densest and most important of the site. Amazingly, the primary function of this site during the Salinar was a cemetery and a ceremonial center with very scarce evidence of domestic occupation. Let's talk about some previous work. The very first excavations yielding Salinar material were done by Francisco Iriarte around 1964, 1965. So 3 years later, and he died in the Colonial Church and in Pampa La Cruz. 3 years later, the Chanchan Moche Valley project, directed by Mosley and Maxi, started excavations at several sites in this valley, including Huanchaco. They reported a large Salinar occupation that expanded from the east side of Huanchaco towards the east for about 1.5 kilometers. The first time I read this, I have to admit, my first impression was that they were very wrong. But it turned out to be true, as you will see later in this presentation. The only published material on the Moche Chanchan Valley project related to Salinar in Huanchaco were a couple of burials found next to the Colonial Church and field notes used by Mujica and Brennan in their respective theses. During the 1980s and 1990s, archaeologists from the University of Trujillo directed excavations at Pampa La Cruz and on the west side of the Colonial Church, finding burials and architecture associated with Salinar. Genaro Bar was the first archaeologist characterizing the Salinar occupation in Huanchaco, defining that it was before Viru and it was that it was domestic in nature. The most common materials were the white on red ceramic sherds and large jars decorated with the same technique, mainly found at Pampa La Cruz, and you can see some photos of that. An interesting thesis written by Jorge Sachun suggested that the Salinar occupation was related with a major flood, possibly a mega enflow event. This observation will be expanded and discussed later in this presentation. In 1999, Victor Piminchumo excavated a couple of units on the west side of the Colonial church, is the picture on the left, finding a couple of burials of the Salinar period and domestic refuse associated with this occupation. In 2012, Victor Campaña directed an evaluation project at Pampa La Cruz, excavating more than 100 test pits on the street of Las Lomas town. That's the name of the modern town laying on top of Pampa La Cruz, which is currently covering more than 98% of the site. So there, Campaña reported an early Salinar occupation, confirming Barr's observation. Campaña also found the base of the distribution of a white and red ceramic shard. The Salinar occupation was the largest at Pampa La Cruz, against the assumptions that the site was possibly reach its maximum extension during the Viru and Moche occupation. So from the 11 hectares that were supposed to be this Pampa La Cruz site, the 11 hectares are actually covered in different densities by Salinar occupation, while the Viru and the Moche are strictly restricted to the southwest side sector of the site. So that was a big surprise that was first identified by Victor. And that I think is important because it confirms the assumptions made by the Chanchan Moche Valley project that the Salinar was really very strong occupation in Huanchaco. Okay, so let's talk about the residential occupation and domestic aspects of the Salinar occupation in Huanchaco based on our own excavations. So in 1996, Brian Billman proposed that Pampa La Cruz and Iglesia Colonial was a single site that was brutally split by a massive landslide that created the current Quebrada Rio Seco. Although this is an interesting idea that could indeed enlarge the surface of the Salinar occupation at Huanchaco up to 40 hectares, I believe that both sides, so Pampa La Cruz on the southern side of the Quebrada Rio Seco and La Iglesia Colonial in the north bank, were actually two different clusters, occupational clusters, occupied basically at the same time. So the calculated total surface of the Salinar occupation in Huanchaco at Pampa La Cruz is around 11 hectares. However, there is evidence of other residential clusters under the modern town of Huanchaco, and this is something that needs to be explored in the future. Although a general map is not yet available, it seems like the residential settlement at Pampa La Cruz was organized by rectangular enclosures, slightly oriented towards the northeast. The fragmentary information suggests that these rectangular enclosures were separated by narrow corridors that lead to the entrance of the residential compound. And you can see actually here part of a double face wall and a corridor that separates this compound here from the other one on this area that wasn't excavated. So large open plazas are not discarded since they are present in Huanchaco since the initial period of Gramalote, so during the initial period. So these rectangular enclosures possibly host more than one nuclear family or constitute multi-family units due to its size and large open patios. Until we excavate one of those complete architectural compounds, our interpretations unfortunately are limited. In the interior of these rectangular enclosures, a number of activities were performed. The residential occupation was possibly on the side, on one side of the enclosure, and it was a set of smaller roofed rooms with benches for resting. Large areas serve as courtyards where multiple activities were carried out. Some of these activities are related with brewing and storing liquids for daily consumption and perhaps special occasions. Subterranean rectangular and circular bins, like the one you see here on the right, some of them bigger than others, were needed to store food products. One of them had articulated vertebrae of fish, while others had, in addition to articulated fish vertebrae, seabird and marine mammal bones, as well as camelid remains. Therefore, it is possible that the bins were mostly used for food storage. The presence of benches in the courtyard suggests that it was also used for food consumption as well as for other activities, like mending fishing nets and lines, although a very few of them have been found in the domestic sector of Pampa La Cruz. On the contrary, numerous spindle whorls suggest that spinning was an active task done in this area and possibly related with gender. The discovery of special findings in the residential area indicated that domestic life was deeply embedded in ritual activity. So far, two types of rituals were identified. One that we call the terrestre, basically with the offering of dogs, and other that is marine in nature, where they basically use a number of shells, as you can see here on the lower left. Another unusual finding were rounded red and yellow pigments and ceramic miniatures, or special ceramic shapes like whistles and ceramic miniatures. So this is an interesting aspect because it shows that although there is a clear residential occupation here, there was some kind of ritual activity going on at the domestic level. So following Brennan's classification for Cerro Arena architecture, the incomplete evidence of the compounds for at PLC shows also some degree of social stratification, which can be seen in the burial pattern that I will explain later. So in terms of diet, the Salinar people in Huanchaco consume largely small and small medium-sized fish, like drams, like suco or coco, and bagre, and anchovy. The latter, I mean bagre, is interesting because it is only during the Salinar occupation in Huanchaco when these fish get some kind of a special treatment. You know? They are not necessarily, they are present throughout the history of Huanchaco, but they are not as prominent as during the Salinar, and I think that has to do with some kind of different weather conditions. So big fish species were consumed as well, such as corvinas, robalos, and some sharks of the Cacharinidae family, but these were rather the exception than the rule. In terms of other animal proteins, mollusks like the surf clam donuts, the conchitas, and the small-sized mussels in Imitilus algosus are abundant. Gastropods like tegula and stramonitas are common, but other ones like Mitra orientalis and Alsarius are also prominent. And these two, the latter two gastropods are important because they are also prominent in sand beaches, and those has to do also with some kind of different weather conditions. During the Salinar period, people from Huanchaco introduced camelids into their diet. The less frequent presence of dog bones in the midden deposits suggests that dogs may have been consumed as well and not only used for ceremonial purposes. Alternatively, dogs were possibly pets. Camelids were an essential part of the diet since most of the identified specimens are bones of young individuals with multiple cut marks and fracture patterns, suggesting the consumption of the flesh, but also the consumption of the bone marrows for soups and stews. And you can see some butchering patterns here on the right. So the presence of some guinea pigs, the cuyes, points to the consumption of these species as well. Seabirds and marine mammals are present, but in lower quantity, which is surprising for a fishing settlement. I mean, looking for Huanchaco's history. The low focus on marine proteins and higher consumption of camelid meat suggests Salinar people enjoy more llama rather than ceviche. So they enjoy more kind of llama stews rather than ceviche. And this is something that we can talk later. Plants were also consumed, and there is plenty evidence that they had access to a small variety of maize, beans, peanuts, and fruits like pacay. Janina Comeca, a master student at UNT, who was advised and directed by Pilar Babot from Argentina, made remarkable findings analyzing the contents of ceramic vessels from ritual context. Residue analysis from selected large ceramic vessels demonstrated that the plant microfossils were mostly damaged by either boiling or by fermentation or a mixture of both. So they were tomando duro, cerveza. The most common species were maize lucuma and surprisingly cacao. I mean theobroma, but literally cacao. Therefore, it has been suggested that Salinar settlers were consuming fermented beverage made of a residue combining maize, lucuma fruit, and cacao. The latter is not local, and it must have been brought from the distant Amazon region. And I will return to this later, but this is not a single isolated finding. I mean, there are cacao in every single vessel we are looking. So it was a constant flow of cacao in Huanchaco. And apparently this is the earliest presence of cacao on the coast of Peru. So soil samples taken from floors and herbs analyzed by Dr. Dana Bardol yield maize kernels, cupels, golden berries, and a species of sunflower family, guavas and lucuma. Other plants such as tillandsias, cotton, and gourd were also found by Dr. Barton. So these results confirm Comeca and Babot's findings in the residue analysis, suggesting that Salinar people had access to maize as well as many local fruits and exotic plants such as cacao. So now we are moving to the ceremonial sector in the north bank of this dry riverbed known as Quebrada de Rio Seco. And this is the Iglesia Colonial de Huanchaco site. So during the Salinar occupation, there was a straightforward division of the space. The southern sector of Huanchaco was the residential area, while the northern side of the dry riverbed was a vast cemetery and ceremonial center. This corresponds to the Iglesia Colonial de Huanchaco, and it covers an area of approximately 2 hectares. So the site itself has like 55 hectares, but the Salinar is just focusing the area that is highlighted here. So, so between 400 and 200 BC, this site experienced 3 major changes, and then we call phase 1 being the earliest, and then phase 2, and then phase 3 being the latest one. So I'm going to start describing each of these phases. So the stratigraphic control was much more clear in this sector than in the domestic one. So that's why we were able to subdivide in these 3 different phases. So, and this is the area that I'm talking about. So the earliest phase was around 400 to 350 BC, and of course this is just an speculation because the coastal plateau and the flat and terrible dates that we're getting are giving some trouble. So, and during this time, so this early phase, it was a cemetery with no evidence of architecture. Many burials were placed directly on the sterile soil, while others were intruding previous Kupisnike occupations. There is a Kupisnike occupation there. So it seems that during this time, the Salinar were disturbing Kupisnike burials to place their dead or to simply remove the contents of these burials. 2 cases are very illustrative of these actions. So the burial that is on top, is burial 334, was an oval chamber built during Kupisnike times, but the original individual placed there was disturbed, and then it was removed to place a Salinar burial, which had a nice bottle depicting a seated man with a strange hairstyle that you will see it later. The other case is burial IG 514, that is the one that you see in the lower part, and which was also an oval Kupisnike chamber that was originally roofed with whale ribs. In this case, the Salinar did not place a new user, but simply disturbed the main occupant, and it was an adult male, and took most of the offerings, leaving behind a corn popper vessel, the typical canchero, right, the one that is here on the left, known as canchero, which is identical or very similar to the one that Dr. Onuki found at Kunturwase. Similarly, a beautiful necklace of chrysocolla beads was found along with some carved bone and classic Kupisnike-style ceramic fragments. A date taken from the organic material attached to the interior edge of the chamber returned a date of 900-850 calibrated BC. Up to this point, a few burials and hearts have been found for this phase. So this phase must be the time when the first settlers were building their residences at the nearby Pampa La Cruz. So this is still poorly understood, but it's clear that there is an early attempt of the Salinar people to place themselves, you know, on top of this Kupisnike occupation and burying their dead in this sector. The next occupation, phase 2, was possibly around 350 and 250 BC, so around 100 years. And it consists of a massive construction horizon, mainly on the southern side of the site. During this time, at least 3 U-shaped enclosures open to the northeast were erected. And I can point here. So this is one U-shaped enclosure. The one in the middle is the second one, and the third one is over there. They were aligned from east to west, and 2 of them shared the characteristic of having an elevated niched platform on its southern wall. Within the U-shaped enclosure, there was an open space where a few large ceramic vessels were found. And I call the UC from U-shaped structure number 1 and so forth. So the first one, I want to talk about the one here on the west side, was located on the west side, measuring approximately 90 square meters. In this structure, many fragments of musical instruments, basically ceramic panpipes, were found, including a large number of small shaped and notched sherds, as if they were used for fishing lines weights. So during this phase, 9 individuals were buried inside, and you can see the burials drawn here in this plan. Let me see where I am. Okay, so 9 individuals were buried inside, and 5 were adult males, 1 adult female, and 3 sub-adults. At least one of the adult males was of high status. And this is just a view from the west to the east of the U-shape. So you see the lower, the southern platform with the niches here, and then the U-shape opening in this way. This stone alignment was basically a retaining wall that was placed during a renovation project inside. So, and these are the panpipes, and also a trumpet that we found inside, and many other fragments of musical instruments. So this elite burial that we found out of the 9 that were found inside was a 40 years old male at the time of death, and he was buried with 3 ceramic vessels, a complete dog, a beautiful ceramic figurine depicting a male playing a panpipe, 4 bone shell pins, and made in ceramic spindleworks. Close to his mouth, he had 2 gold sheets. On his right hand, he was holding a wooden hand with a gold sheet, and on the left hand, he held a carved limestone depicting a marine bird and profusely decorated with an interlocking design, as you can see in the lower left and the lower right. In the middle, it has a hole that had traces of red pigment that was identified by cinnabar. Our good friend Brandon Risudo did the analysis and turned it out to be cinnabar. And another gold sheet was found inside this hole, as you can see there. Interestingly, the adult woman buried nearby presents a severe case of osteosarcoma, and she had a very poor health at the time of death, while the elite male was actually in good shape. So we can see some interesting differences there. Okay, so the second U-shaped structure, the one here in the middle, it has around 80 square meters of surface area, and it has around 8 or 9 individuals buried inside. And inside, we found a cache of ceramic blocks. I don't know if I have a picture of that. Oh, sorry, I'm missing that, so I'm going to skip it. But from out of the 9 individuals, 2 of them were clearly of high status. So one is 271, that is the one that you see in the upper right, and he was again an adult male who at the time of death was healing a severe depression made by a sharp instrument in his skull. It was healing but also infected at the time of death, so he never got recovered. He was buried with a large gold nose ornament and a pair of necklaces combining beads made of gold, malachite, and sodalite with spondylus shell beads. A very coarse olla was placed on his left side. The other individual was placed immediately east of 271, and this individual was possibly an adult female, and it was buried with 13 ceramic vessels and a beautiful gold nose ornament decorated with spiral motifs along its edges, as you can see in the picture. She was buried with a dog, and one of the ceramic vessels was a carinated bowl with a lateral handle that was filled with red paint. Nearby, other individuals buried in this structure had stone and shell bead necklaces, some stone carved instruments, and one of them had a skeleton of a parrot, which could be a species brought from the Amazon region. However, none of these individuals had gold ornaments as the 2 described previously. So then finally, and here you see a detail of the 271 nose ring, and one of the necklaces made of these very solid malachite beads. So the last U-shaped building, the one here on the right, is the UC3. So it was slightly bigger than the former 2 U-shaped enclosures, with an approximately area of 100 square meters. It was located immediately east of number 2, and inside we found 5 burials that none of them were actually elite burials, as we consider elite, no presence of gold and so. Like the first one, it has a niche wall on its south side, and also we found numerous fragments of carved well bones representing architectural models that were surprisingly concentrated inside this building. These fragments are similar to a complete one that I'm going to show later. Near the niches, a large block of black quartz was found, and that's the one on top. And nearby, a few prints of quartz along a quartzite block were also recorded. In this structure, we documented 2 incomplete clay cones with no decoration, but very similar to the ones reported by Chiquan for Huanchaco and Kailan in the Moche Valley. On the northern end of this third U-shaped structure, it was found a large semi-subterranean storage facility. This is the largest ever found in Huanchaco for the Salinar period, and it has 1.6 meters in depth and an estimated diameter of 2.5 meters. As you can see, we couldn't finish the excavation of this building, but right on the profile. At the time of the abandonment, a complete dog was carefully placed inside. In the southern sector of these U-shaped structures, a large patio seems to have been used as a large kitchen due to the presence of many ceramic fragments and large ceramic vessels covered with soot. Along the central sector, 9 additional burials were found, but none of them show evidence of high status when compared with the ones found in the U-shaped structures. Only one burial, 360, the one that you see over there, had more offerings than the other 8 in this sector. It was possibly a woman, an adult woman, buried with 6 ceramic vessels and a set of 6 shawl pins, one of them with an avian design. In addition, this individual had a chunk of red pigment, a bone spoon, and a few spondylus and malachite beads. Inside one of the ceramic vessels, 4 spindle works were found, 2 made of stone and the other 2 of ceramic. Immediately west of this patio, there seems to be another niched structure, but it was just partially excavated. Actually, this is an excavation that was directed by Feren Castillo last year in the middle of the pandemic. As you can see, it has these beautifully preserved niches, but we couldn't continue the excavation due to time and all the limitations of COVID. We anticipate that future excavations in this sector will help us to learn more about the architectural layout of this large extended compound that, as you can see, only fragments of it can be excavated and explored. But in addition, also large ceramic vessels were found here and some burials as well. So now phase 3, during this phase, there was a major change in the dynamics of this ceremonial and cemetery center. The users backfilled all of the architectural compounds, including the U-shaped enclosures and the large patio. Unfortunately, the scarce architectural evidence, the walls that you see over there, were heavily intruded and disturbed by later Viru and Moche occupations. But as you can see, we can reconstruct partially what is being found there. So an interesting aspect of this occupation is that the large ceramic vessels, instead of having the typical white or red decoration, they have these beautifully and profusely decorated with zoomorphic designs like felines and starfish, estrellas de mar. Other were the typical white or red ceramic jars. One remarkable discovery was the construction of 2 U-shaped structures, but in miniature. I mean, these are little representations of the former U-shaped structures found in the northern side, but during this time they were already covered and buried. So it reinforced the fact that these U-shapes were indeed important in the community, and that those represent symbols of power. And as we know, the U-shape came from the initial period and even before. So, this is what I would say, if we see the pictures here, you can see the ceramic vessels all over the place during this late Salinar occupation, very close to the surface. But, when you see this U-shape resembles, audiencias, of course, they are missing the niches and so forth. but it's a very nice antecedent in the Moche Valley for these kind of structures. So another remarkable discovery, and we found a little ceramic bottle associated with this one. Actually, Brian Billman was digging this one, and he's the one who found it. So another remarkable finding is the presence of emblematic stone masons. Some of them are beautifully carved, while others are simply rounded. In this occupational level, at least 2 typical arrow points were found. These weapons are reported for the Casma Valley in Chanquillo, and in the sites of the Nepeña and Santa Valleys and at Cerro Arena, and this is a fragment of one of them. Another unusual finding was a concentration of tungsten. Here. This kind of a brilliant blue-gray mineral. So tungsten is very well known in Trujillo because it's mainly quarried and mined in the area of Santiago de Chuco. There is a famous poem written by César Vallejo, El Tungsteno, right? And this was a very unusual finding. As I said, Brandon Rizzuto is the one who actually did the PXRF and identifying tungsten, which is definitely not local. So this is coming from the Sierra. And nearby, we found an architectural model carved on a whalebone vertebrae, which is rounded, which its rounded layout suggests that the architecture represented there could be of buildings found in the highlands of Huamachuco and Santiago de Chuco, more than 150 kilometers east of Huanchaco. And this association, the association of this object found in Huanchaco and this site of Cerro Zaramonga in Santiago de Chuco was actually identified by Luis Flores de la Oliva, one of our archaeologists. So there is a clear connection with the highlands. So the diversity and quality of artifacts documented at La Iglesia Colonial de Huanchaco sharply contrasts with the more moderate material culture of Pampa La Cruz. This fact suggests to me that Salinar people did a great investment in producing objects and obtaining exotic goods to be displayed or used in ceremonial activity related with the cult to the ancestor and the celebration of the dead. So current evidence suggests that the Salinar occupation in Huanchaco represented an unprecedented time of population increase as viewed in the area of the residential settlement. This is reinforced by the abundance of dogs, which are known to be scavengers. I believe dogs were gathering around large amounts of garbage produced by the Salinar residents in Huanchaco, and soon after were included in their daily life as pets and as tokens of ceremonial activity. Their importance can be seen when they are included in elite burials, offerings in storage deposits, and in ceremonial feastings. Due to the deep deposits covering the Salinar residential occupation in Huanchaco, it is still difficult to assert the distribution of residences and public spaces. This is something that will need to be addressed in the future by the aid of magnetometers, GPRs, and all that technology. Although one could argue that Brennan's complicated classification of Salinar architecture from Cerro Arena is reflecting a very complex hierarchical system within the society is problematic, I would like to suggest that the diversity in the quantity and quality of the burial goods associated with the dead in the La Iglesia Colonial cemetery points to a similar conclusion. Some burials emphasize gold ornaments and less ceramic vessels, while others do exactly the opposite. Some of them are buried with elaborate chambers with no offerings, while others are in chambers and with fancy ceramics and gold jewelry. A common factor, though, is the advanced age of the deceased, who are always over 35, 50 years old, suggesting that rank and status was acquired through the aging in Salinar society. Is this reflecting emerging social inequality and classes during the late early horizon? This is a complicated question to answer, and it deserves to be explored from multiple angles. Jordi Rivera, my current grad student here at UF, is going to explore this question through the filter of bioarchaeological studies, comparing her results with mortuary data, such as type of offerings, quantity, quality, and the like. She will also conduct isotopic analysis on selected individuals to check if bone chemistry corresponds with the social status and material culture of these individuals. So this is going to be a very cool research that is going to happen soon. Another important venue for future studies is that Salinar were connected to an interregional exchange network. This is the only possibility, I believe, can explain the presence of cacao and Amazonian parrots in Huanchaco. Okay, and even if this parrot is from coastal lands, you know, the cacao is clearly not from this region. So the big question again is whether if they obtain it through a down the line exchange system, or if people from this distant region came down to Huanchaco. Preliminary biodistance analysis carried out by Rich Suter in the Salinar pit suggests that there is a high degree of genetic diversity when compared with the previous initial period population of Gramalote and the Viru individuals from Huanchaco. Therefore, it can be suggested that the late early horizon does represent a moment of high social mobility and interaction, possibly fostered by the desire to obtaining exotic products which distribution canals were possibly more restricted during the first part of the early horizon, specifically during the Chavin sphere of interaction. So if Huanchaco is showing this high index of interaction, I wonder how it may have been in other sites of the valley like Cerro Arena, Cerro Oreja, or Cerro La Virgen. Would it be Huanchaco the exception or the rule? And this is something that I would like to discuss if there is time later. The direct availability of marine resources and its relatively easy procurement must have provided local fishermen and their families the possibility of disposing key resources for highlanders and Amazonian people: marine salt, seaweeds, fresh and dry fish or mollusks, and also a vast variety of baskets and mats woven using local reeds. The emphasis on camelids in the diet of the Huanchaco Salinar occupation suggests a major shift in food habits, which must have been the result of cultural preferences prompted by a more fluent interaction with non-coastal people. The emphasis of consuming camelid meat will not change until the conquest of the Spanish in the 16th century. So it was a big change, and it's happening actually during the Salinar time. Preliminary analysis on ceramics done by Isabel Druck, and this is an ongoing project, suggests two different spheres of production. Domestic wares were done by expert potters who had a better control of clays and sand, as well as the fighting process. This better technology allowed them to produce large ceramic vessels, some of them of local origin based on current petrographic analysis, but this will be confirmed by the aid of scanning electron microscopy analysis on clay samples already at the Florida Museum of Natural History, and that will be analyzed under the direction of Dr. Lindsay Block. Currently, we have taken thin sections of domestic and fine ceramic work, and that will give us a better sense of ceramic production, distribution, and usage during this time. An interesting finding is that some bottles of a yellowish clay are definitely not from the coast and were coming from the highlands. Beyond the white on red description, the Salinar manufactured large oval shaped yards and expanded nets. These ceramic vessels had a storage capacity between 50 and 150 liters. Other ceramic vessels are much bigger, having capacities over 300 liters. Large bowls were also used for feasting occasions. I'm sorry, I should be showing this one. So most domestic pots were of a spherical or rounded body, while most of the pots included in the burials had these carinated bodies, what we call the platillos voladores. This one here. So bottles with single spout and lateral handles were also common. Decoration was primarily white painting, but applications and incisions were common as well. The common pattern of netted decoration from the Nepeña Valley is also present in Huanchaco, but in low quantities. As a preliminary observation, a sculptural ceramic vessel seems to be less frequent during the late Salinar phases of Huanchaco. So, sorry that I'm passing this so fast, but so these guys are more common in the earlier Salinar phase. So, okay. So metallurgy is also another major innovation in the Huanchaco area during the Salinar occupation. At Gramalote and during the Cupisnique occupation, I have not reported metal artifacts. And of course, the Cupisnique is something that we just started to find. So maybe next year I'm gonna have to, say that I was wrong. But up to date, it seems that at least during the early initial period, Gramalote, no metals. And then the very scarce evidence in Cupisnique, just a few of them. So, however, during the Salinar, a few copper utilitarian objects like spindle whorls and needles were found. At least one gilded copper nose ornament was also found in an elite burial, and this is the one right here in the middle. The majority of metal objects were those made of gold. Preliminary PXRF analysis carried out by Brandon Risuto, and I hope that Brandon is there, yield the typical proportion of gold, silver, and copper observed in native gold mined in river streams. At least one object had a high content of silver, suggesting that it may have been an alloy, but I will leave that to Brandon, and he will be the one talking about that. What I would like to highlight here is the fact that for the first time, metal jewelry showed up in the Huanchaco maritime community, indicating social inequality. So both male and women seems to have access to these objects, but up to date, no subadults or even young adults have been found as holders of these fancy metal artifacts. Another open question is how these metal objects were obtained, and also who made them and where. So these are questions that will demand more research, and in the future, we should emphasize excavations at other late early horizon settlements to identify the workshops where these objects were manufactured. The same could be said for the beads found in certain burials. Malachite, sodalite, turquoise, and spondylus shell beads were all used for its manufacturing. So an open question is whether they were locally produced or if they came from other sites in the Moche Valley or from other valleys. So just to finish here, the late early horizon, and particularly the Salinar society, is the germ of later urban complex societies who were deeply embedded in artisanal production. If the rest of the Salinar settlements in the Moche Valley had access to metal jewelry, fancy beads, and large networks of ceramic production, then the Salinar was an unprecedented time of social development and complex economic dynamics that was attached to a vast interregional exchange network. This fluid transit must have prompted an active flow of genetic exchange as well as cultural patterns. So we need to explore more of Salinar, but I hope that this presentation may have given you a new angle to think about their complexity and past accomplishments, and then finally going beyond the white on red horizon. Well, thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Gabriel. Thank you very much for the great presentation. And well, mine is just a comment on this mobility during the late early horizon. And you know, I know that a few years ago it was published this idea that Salinar might have come from the highlands, and you know, I'm a bit skeptical about that, to be honest. And you know, and I share this idea of great mobility and you know, and this circulation of goods that you have shown. You know, metals and even cocoa from the Amazon, and other goods from possibly from the islands and the Amazon again. I know that, for example, Alicia Boswell found these settlements, Salinar settlements, and even Brian Billman in the upper Moche Valley. So, you know, these people might have been sorts of maybe outposts of Salinar people, you know, that had this role of communicating with or interacting with people in the highlands and in the Amazon. So I think it's a very interesting period, and as you said, there is a lot to discover.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and this is, you know, what really amazed me is that Huanchaco is such a small place. I mean, I don't think is just you know, a unique case. I think that this is just part of a bigger kind of reality during this time. And therefore, we need to really look at other sites, to start thinking on Salinar, just beyond, surveys. And so we need to start to dig in and see how these people were actually living and making all these beautiful artifacts that were, commodities that were exchanged back and forth during this time period.
Yeah, and maybe even going beyond this idea of fighting communities, because at least from what you've shown, it doesn't seem that there is not this great emphasis on war, because we have in mind the idea of Cerro Arena, Cerro Bitin, and other like Chanquillo, big fortified sites, but here it doesn't seem the case. I don't know if you can confirm that.
Well, it's interesting that at least from the point of view of the weapons, whether these weapons were used or not, they are mostly found in the last Salinar occupation. So I think that after 250 BC to 150 BC is when they were actively used. But I forget to mention though that Celeste Gagnon, and who is also a research associate to this project, and my student Jordi Rivera, I mean, they have found a highly, a very frequent and unusual number of bone traumas, especially on males. And this is something that we will confirm by the end of this and next year. But there is an unusual, evidence of interpersonal violence. Like, one of the burials that I showed, this guy with the beautiful nose ring, he had this injury that caused his death, and that was made by a weapon for sure. But there are other cases, so this is something that we need to confirm. I mean, we haven't found any fortified site in Huanchaco. I think that was not the case. That the nature of war was different, and I like to think like Ivan Gessi, that suggests that they were protecting, that they were defending these major shrines and ceremonial centers like Chanquillo, where he actually found evidence of clear, fortresses, but at the same time a ceremonial center. So perhaps war was focused like during the Middle Age times when, crusades were actually hosting in, places like Jerusalem or things like that. They were trying to get back their relics or whatever they were looking. So, but there is no doubt, on my opinion, that there was definitely a peak in violence. Not only in the Moche, but certainly in Santa and other valleys as well.
And do you have more information about, you mentioned that red paint in one of the vessels. Do you know, I think you said that in one of the vessels there was red paint. Did you do analysis on that or?
Yes, yeah. We have worked with Professor Wilder Aldama at University of Trujillo and Doctora Elvira Ceballos from San Marcos University. We've been conducting XRF analysis, laser ablation as well. And a number of samples were actually sent to France, to the Bordeaux laboratory with Dr. Remy Chapuli, where Dr. Aldama also spent a month or 2 months working with the collections and part of the team at the University of Trujillo. And they have identified that, some of these red paints are cinnabar, but they are basically hematite. So these oxides, these ferrous oxides, but those are different. Apparently, those are different from the ones that we identify for Gramalote from the nearby source of Cerro Campana. So I've seen that this hematite was coming from a different source, and that makes that very interesting because it tells us that this product was also traded and not necessarily quarried in the nearby mines. I think Alexa had a question.
Hi, Gabriel. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi. I don't know if I froze. Can you hear me? Sorry. Yeah, really fascinating talk. Thanks for sharing all of their ongoing research. I had a question about considering Salinar and sort of where it's situated in terms of the chronology, coming after Chavin, before Moche. And I was curious about some of your impressions about how to go about studying Salinar, considering autochthonous development in cultural patterns versus this sort of back and forth with the highlands, intervalley regions, and sort of some of your impressions now with this ongoing research about considering Salinar both on its own, but as kind of this part of this broader world and networks. Just because I think the tendency in a lot of, if it's not sort of Chavin, if it's not Moche, if it's not Wari, the tendency is to sort of consider these phases as these intermediate periods or these sort of in-between phases, and they're not given as much credit as they should. And in moving forward, a lot of the technological developments and cultural changes. So I was curious in terms of some of your impressions around what Salinar took with Chavin influence, but also what was already in the coast that time, but also what Salinar gave to later periods and contemporary periods, both in the North Coast as well as into the highlands. So it's not necessarily just highlands to the coast, but also sort of coastal back into highland influence. So I was kind of curious about your impressions of that from the evidence you have.
Yeah. So, you know, we were very lucky. We're very lucky in Huanchaco over the last 3 years. We've been collecting many radiocarbon dates. Up to now, we have more than 200 dates. And so we've been, you know, but Salinar is the one that every single day that we sent, you know, turned out to be, you know, completely wrong or bad. So that's why I only have 9. But, you know, it's a good start. And so it's clear. So honestly, from the point of view of the Huanchaco project and based on our stratigraphy, with some adjustments that we need to do, I feel very comfortable with the intermediate horizons sequence. I mean, at least in Huanchaco, it works very well. You know, I don't see any problems there. But what is tricky to us, and we are trying to understand more carefully, is that we see a clear disruption from the initial period towards the Salinar occupation. So there is a major shift in the diet, and we don't know if this has to do with ENSO events or with a major change in the climate weather, in the climate pattern. We don't know. So that's why we need to understand Cupisnique, so the previous, you know, occupation, to see this transition. But I think that the major contribution of the Chavin sphere of interaction, that as we know, it was clearly present in Caballo Muerto, right? I mean, there is the iconography, the dates, the ceramics, you know, everything is in there. So it's not like the case in Nepeña, where there seems to be some boundaries and some limits to the extent of Chavin, as is suggested by David and others. But in Moche, you know, you would assume that Chavin had an impact. And I think that the most important impact is that it helps to open up these interregional networks. That for some reason during the Chavin times, those were controlled, extremely controlled perhaps, by this religious, you know, faction or movement, whatever you want to call it, you know. But then suddenly, after the collapse of Chavin de Huantar, these networks were open and those were available for common people. That's the only explanation that I can give for the presence of that you know, 200 years later, fishermen were wearing fancy gold nose rings that you would expect only in places like Pacopampa or Conturhuasi, or even at Chavin de Huantar itself. You know, so then you see that this technology and these prestige artifacts are available for common people. You know, and then that was carried again during the Moche time, because then they were restricting the circulation of gold and so, you know, so it's interesting. So that's option 1. Then option 2 is that we are facing in Huanchaco something like Paracas, which is actually about the same time. And then what is going on is that people from different locations in the valley are coming to be buried in Huanchaco, and they are not Huanchaco settlers. It could be, you know, because most of the Paracas, as we know, that those were in fishermen settlers, you know, these were people from the valley and from distant regions that happens to be desired to be buried in front of the sea. So that's why this work is so important now, because we are going to run the isotopic analysis, and we are also expecting to do some genetic analysis with Lars Fehrenschmidt at the University of Santa Cruz in the future. So then we can actually, test this hypothesis through this hard data and see where is the provenience of these guys. Our expectations, our preliminary analysis suggests that these elite guys were actually local, because they have all of the bone insertion, all of the bone contexture that resembles typical classic fishermen. But at the time of death, they assumed this other, social person, where they were assuming their roles as warriors or leaders. No, but I think that, coming back to your question, that Chavin really opened up that possibility. The system collapsed, but the contact between the people, the network itself, survived, and that was, somehow, used by the Salinar. The other big one, and I think that again, the Cupisnique is crucial, is the introduction of camelids, because in Gramalote, we only have 5 remains of camelids, 2 phalanges and 3 incisors teeth. That's it. But then in Salinar, we have hundreds of bones, and we have someone already working on that. I mean, there are so many, and not only adult individuals, but we have also subadults and juveniles, which suggests to us, that they were consuming camelids in great quantity. And those definitely came from somewhere, maybe from the highlands, or again, the Chavin interaction was influencing that cultural patterns in terms of food consumption. Yeah. So I don't think if I answer your question, but it's complicated.
Yeah, no, I definitely think it definitely is. The other thing that I thought was really interesting with your talk, and some of the ideas and interpretations that you now have, and I'm sure with years more of excavation, those will be revised. But I thought one of the things that was quite interesting was about sort of at what age those social markers are used, and what privileges are given to people depending on their age. And I wouldn't necessarily want to give sort of broad strokes, but in later periods, it seems like younger individuals can have those more elite associated objects. So it might be something as well. And I don't know if it's a Chavin influence or sort of other things going on in the Salinar period, but when that starts to shift, when those earlier periods in life are deemed appropriate to in death obtain.
Yeah, so for sure in Gramalote, we don't have any evidence of high status burials in subadults, and even in the adults. But for the Salinar occupation, it's clear that only these adults, actually elderly individuals, these are people over 50 years old, some of them. And and these bones have been analyzed by Celeste Gagnon, by John Verano, by Jordi, and the 3 of them, analyzing at different times, came to the same conclusion, that these guys were very old at the time of death. And those are exclusively the only ones who got all of these, prestige and basically all these gold ornaments. Of course, I can be wrong. Probably someone watching this conference right now is saying, oh, but you are looking everything through the eyes of gold because you are from the North Coast and the Sipan effect and so forth. But it is true. I mean, this is a very unusual metal artifact, very shiny, a special one that is present there. And when it shows up, it seems to be related just with these very old guys. So far we haven't found any evidence of subadults with prestige artifacts yet. But for the later occupation, for the Biru, which dates between 100 BC and 450 AD, we have at least 3 or 4 children with gold and with some, not gold, gilded copper ornaments and fancy ceramics, which clearly marks, that those were inherited, through their families or whatever. So it's really marking. So what really, one of my questions is, how did these people get those artifacts? Under which conditions? Did they go to ceremonial centers or to a special place in Cerro Arena, or, to a fancy place in Cerro Vitín? I mean, how did they get these artifacts? Under which conditions? Did they go to Chanquillo to pray and they get a gold? And again, this is not just fancy ceramics. You know, we are talking about a clear emblem of political prestige and power in the Andean tradition. Nose rings were basically worn by high status people. And interestingly, the most remarkable findings in gold in Huanchaco are these gold ornaments that later on will be only used by the Moche elite. So, you know, this is the very foundations of that. But in this case, this is worn again by what it seems to be common people from a fishing village. So I think that deserves, of course, more studies in the future. But I can tell you for sure that as early as 400 BC, you know, people in the coast were already, you know, taking advantage of these symbols for their own, you know, necessities or whatever.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if someone else has some questions here on Zoom. I don't see questions on Facebook at the moment. So if we don't have other questions, I would like to say thank you again to Gabriel for his time and for the wonderful presentation. And of course, you know, it's good to hear something different about Huanchaco, because there is a lot to say about this site, and not only human sacrifices, as you said, because you know, that's great to hear also that. So thank you very much again, and we will see you during our next talk in October. We will be advertising that in our social media. So have a good weekend, everybody, and thank you again.
Thanks to you all. Thank you for organizing this.